All right, good morning. Thank you for waking up after the closing party last night and decide to choose to join us this morning, building the perfect Windows image or Windows 8 image.
Yeah, they were forced to choose between all the other sessions at this time.
Oh yeah, there are plenty of other sessions.
Yes.
We are still happy you're here. All right. My name is Johan. This is Michael. We will be your host for the next 75 minutes, and we have recorded a grand finale video for this from this MMS, from the travel to here and some of the stuff we've been seeing this week and been doing. So let's switch over and run that video. This is instead of a speaker introductions.
The audio is too low. And we are done. That is MMS in a nutshell. Walking, 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 walking.
MMS in a minute, 5 minutes. All right.
I didn't do that.
All right.
Keep away from me.
This session is based out of 4 pillars. How to create perfect images that can be worked and deployed with any deployment solution known to man. We'll be using light touch to do that. We will show how to deploy them through Config Manager and VMM and VDI and Windows Deployment Services and whatever we can come up with. And of course, we will mention our legacy as well. Windows 7 is still around. Okay. Now, in Windows 8, at least if you compare with XP, deployment changed a little bit. It went from a scripted setup to an image-based setup. So since the Vista timeframe, everything has been image-based. But what most companies have started to realize when they start to do Windows 8 deployment projects is that the image is slightly larger than the XP image is. So an XP image used to be maybe half gig in size, whereas a Windows 8 image is 2 gigs, the 32-bit one, and 2.5 gig, almost 3 gigs, the 64-bit version. Add in Office and a few updates to it, and you suddenly have an image that is 4, 5, 6 gigs in size. And of course, that means that if you have a distributed environment, and in the past you were possibly able to deploy a client in a branch office directly from a distribution point or a deployment server standing in another location, that was actually possible because the image was so small. Now the image is growing larger, so we need to make sure that the image is being placed closer to the clients through various technologies. One thing that you can do to improve network bandwidth and reduce deployment time is to actually start adding stuff into the reference image. In deployment projects, me and Michael, we fight hard, really hard, to keep a thin image, rather thin image. We'll come back to that later, but the general idea about having a thin image is that it will give you the most flexibility when you deploy it. The more stuff you pack into a WIM file, the less flexible it becomes when you actually deploy it. And the more frequent you're likely to update it. But come back to that in a few slides here. So, Michael?
Oh God, yes. Thin versus thick. It's actually 2 approaches. But the first and most important thing is that it's like comparing Johan against me. And I'm not the thin one.
I think healthy is the correct term.
I prefer to have a thin image, absolutely. But sometimes it's not possible to do that. So what is the decision between doing thin or a thick image? Well, the decision is time. It has only to do with time, mainly. There are some other reasons sometimes, but mainly it's about time. The time you are allowed to spend when you install Windows. If the threshold value is 15 hours, why should you spend time on creating a reference image? A normal setup will take less than 15 hours, right? So why do you want to invest in something that doesn't gain anything? So when I ask customers, I ask them for what is the maximum time allowed to install Windows, and they go, oh, we don't have any. Okay, so let's say 200 hours. Are you insane? 200 hours? It needs to be less. Oh, so you have a threshold. Yeah, maximum like 2 hours. Okay, 2 hours. Then we need to create a reference image and we need to update it by around 2 times a year. Okay. Could we have 45 minutes? Absolutely. Then I need to do a thick image. And you need to update it basically once a month to keep it up. Time is essence, right? So the downside of having a thick image is that it needs to be updated. And you need to test it very much. Because every time you do an update, you also need to verify that all the application works, and so on and so on. The benefit of having a thin image is that it's flexible. It doesn't contain anything except for the operating system.
And updates.
Exactly. So here's the thing. A thin image is supposed to contain only the operating system. But that's not true. Even if we consider a thin image, we consider it to be a hybrid. We add things like patches and updates. We add things related to the operating system. That could be Service Pack whatever for .NET Framework. It could be a part of .NET Framework 3 or 4 because we consider that to be a part of the operating system. There's no danger of adding those components into the reference image since we are running Windows Update in the end of the creation process. All Microsoft software will most likely to be updated using WSUS. Adding third-party applications, however, is a bit more tricky.
Could you please mention some stuff that would make perfect sense to put in reference image?
Absolutely. Office. Office is one. Office takes time to install. Visual Studio. Visual Studio makes sense. It takes time to install. If you do servers, you might want to have an image that is including SQL Server, because SQL Server takes time to install and it does support sysprepping, and it's something that we do when we do Virtual Machine Manager and want to provide services. Then we deploy a server that is already made and configured for SQL Server.
All right, something you would absolutely not put in a reference image.
Besides World of Tanks, I wouldn't put an antivirus in my reference image. I wouldn't put an antivirus in my reference image based on two things. Number one, it's old the same minute I install it, so it needs to be updated. The update process normally takes longer time than actually installing it. Therefore, I don't gain any time. Therefore, it's pointless. And there are some other things. I wouldn't normally put Acrobat Reader in either. There's nothing wrong with Acrobat Reader. It's just that they update it very frequently, every 8 minutes or so, because that's the amount of checking they do to verify it actually has a new version. I wouldn't put Java in it either for the same reason. It's updated too frequently, so it needs to be replaced immediately after the image has been deployed.
And also, antivirus software in your reference image is one of the top reasons where sysprep actually may break on you. And your image is no longer working when you deploy it to 500 new machines. So antivirus off the image.
You need to understand one thing, though. We work as consultants, right? When we are here, we tell you what we think is the best solution. Does it mean I never install Acrobat Reader? No. Eventually, from time to time, it ends up at a customer that says, that is a requirement, and then I install it. I don't like it, but I do it. As a consultant, I do. I need to adjust to reality too. So sometimes you don't have an option, and in that case, you need to have those applications. It works, it's just tricky to make it perfect.
As Michael said, as a consultant, you're trying at least to be a little bit flexible depending on the environment you run into. There is this one scenario where we will not bend at all. If you want to really freak me out, show me a manual process where you create your reference image. Show me a 10-page document on all the steps that you do manually, installing from a DVD or an ISO your reference image. I will freak out completely.
There's actually a good example of that. Do you remember the first version of server update services, the SUS? It was a manual process. I remember Microsoft doing a great thing about that on some tech ed somewhere, and I go like, yeah, we implemented SUS for a huge organization, blah, 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 blah. And the year after, go like, yeah, we did it, and we failed totally. The first month, about 98% of all the people were actually doing the downloads. After 12 months, less than 2% were clicking on the update to do it manually. Manually processes never works. It has never worked, and it will never work. It needs to be automated.
The reason behind automation is, of course, to reproduce stuff with quality, to make sure that your reference image is equally good every single time you generate it. The solutions that we use, and we're going to show the MBT solution to generate a reference image, has a bit of a learning curve to it. It will take you probably up to an hour to get it going. That's about it. But then at least you have an automated process for your reference image, and we'll show you how to do that. Now, another way to make sure I get that upset is to tell me that you're using a physical machine for your reference images. You're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to use a virtual machine. I don't care if it's Hyper-V or VMware, just as long as it's a virtual machine. Because you can use snapshots, reducing the time it takes to develop that image. And you get a very hardware-independent image. That there is no risk that you have any weird driver application in that image that may cause trouble when you actually deploy it. So you get a better image, you save time and money to create it, and it's dead easy to troubleshoot. If there is an issue, you can bet money on it has nothing to do with the hardware. It's something in your sequence or in your software, in your application, in whatever, but it's not the hardware. All right. Then, these are two acronyms or shortenings for deployment types. It's light touch and zero touch. Its marketing names has nothing to do with technology, though. But light touch is really have become the name of the standalone deployment solution that Microsoft provides, and that's the one we use for creating reference image. CTI happens to be config manager, but both of them can be as manual, wizard-based as you like them to be, or fully automated as you like them to be. So it has nothing depending on the deployment solution. It's more like just names that are being used. Now, if I flip over to my demo environment, you can see that we will happily accept questions through Twitter. I'm monitoring this Twitter feed right here on this laptop. So if you have any questions throughout this session, feel free to post them, and we'll try to answer them while we're speaking. And in the very event we get many questions, we will answer them after the session. And great sessions comes with a reward. Just saying. They're even signed. All right. Reference images. This is a MDT deployment share. You need at least one folder. In this folder, I have added in a few applications. This is the workbench. Most of you have seen it, if you have ever worked with MDT or seen a deployment session. This is just the admin UI for deployment. The tool is, right, very expensive, Michael?
Absolutely. If you download from either Johan's site or my site, you will be charged $50.
Or you can go to Microsoft.com/deployment and download it for free.
Yeah, then it's free. Yeah. We prefer the other way around.
So, in the workbench, you simply import the stuff you want to have in your reference image. And I've downloaded and added a few applications in here. I've added in Silverlight, because it makes sense to have in a reference image that is supposed to be deployed by Config Manager, because Config Manager will install that anyway when it installs the client. It makes sense to have .NET Framework in, but not that one. I will show you one later. And runtimes for C++. Makes sense to put in a reference image. I may want to have Office, or I may not. If everybody in the organization needs Office, put it in the reference image. If only few people will have it, don't put it in the reference image. Add it at deployment time. Then I've added a few operating systems in here. So I have a Windows 8 operating system, and this is the core DVD from Microsoft that I've just imported. So adding an application, right-click New Application, import an OS, right-click New OS, and then I do not worry about drivers at all. There is no point of having a driver in a reference image that is being created in a virtual machine. And
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I need to interrupt here. There's one reason. When you create a reference image that is supposed to be used for Windows to go, you really need to have drivers in it.
yeah, but that's your call later on the session, so you need to wait.
Okay. I'm sorry.
Yeah. We have a script. We need to follow that order.
I haven't seen that script.
Right here.
Perfect. Thank you.
Then you create sequences, and sequences is the replacement for that 10-page of paper I was talking about, what to do when creating reference images. So instead of doing something manually, you create a simple sequence that will contain all the steps that you would normally do manually. For example, partition the drive the way you like it, apply the OS image the way you like it, install a few applications. In this case, I've added in .NET Framework and all the runtimes for C++, and I install Office. .NET Framework 3.5 in this case also include 2 and 3. 4.5 is included by default, which includes 4, and then you sort of have a good foundation for applications. I still call this, well, with the exception of Office, a thin image. To me, it's thin. Then I have done something down here called suspend. It's a built-in script, but by default you cannot add it from the add menu. You actually have to know the name of it. All right. This will add a pause to the sequence. So if you need to do something manually, this is the way to do it. And then everything else will be automated. Later in the process, it will run sysprep, and it will reboot into WinP. It will create the Vim file and store it on the server. So the process is the following. I will find a virtual machine, go to a clean snapshot, mount it on the boot image I get from MDT, this boot image will now start WinP4 in my VM. It will kick off the network. It's a component called WP-init that starts the network. If it fails, you're most likely not using a virtual machine, and you should be using a virtual machine. I have automated the logon because the only user that can access that folder on my server is actually the user I decided to automate. And the way to automate this is on the server, find the bootstrap ini file, which is in the deployment share folder. You can also reach it from the properties of your deployment share. But this is where I simply added in my super secret build account and password. This one is being stored inside the boot image in clear text, but it doesn't matter. I only use it on my laptop. It's secure in that sense. And it's only being used to read a deployment share to which that account only has read access. Going back to the client, I will select my sequence. I will select where to store it, on what server when it's done. And then I have coffee for an hour. Because that's the time it takes. Now I have a fully automated process for building a reference image. And the beauty is this reference image can be used with any deployment solution. Light Touch, Config Manager, VDI for Server 2012, VMM, VMware Library, Altiris, BMC Blade, wherever they can call their stuff. Anything that can deploy a Vim file can deploy a Light Touch image. If you create reference images in, for example, in Config Manager, which is absolutely technically possible, guess what platform that image can be used in? Well, Config Manager. You also get additional features in Light Touch. For example, once the sequence reaches the suspend action, it aborts and gives me a shortcut on the desktop that says resume sequence. If I wanted to do some customizations here, for example, I would like to customize the start screen a bit. I may want to name my groups, Mike's stuff. or whatever. I actually need to press enter to name it. That will help. Mike's stuff. Here we go. Or maybe rearrange, or maybe remove applications, maybe add, maybe pin in new stuff on my start screen. So I'm customizing it a little bit. You can do that through PowerShell as well, some of the components. On the deployment guy's web page or blog page, you actually find scripts that will allow you to do some of these customizations through scripting rather than clicking around like I did. But I have done some customizations to my machine that maybe I found difficult to automate or didn't want to spend time to automate at this point in time. And then, what's my next action? Any ideas? One option could be resume task sequence, click that link. That's incorrect. I take a snapshot, yes, and then I hit the resume. Because that will allow me to, 2 weeks from now, 4 months from now, simply revert to that snapshot, do a few more changes, new snapshot, and hit resume. And this is before sysprep. So I will never run into any issues with rearming and such. Well, Windows 8 doesn't have that problem, but Windows 7 does. And this is just a very convenient way to continue and do the rest, to run sysprep and capture the Vim to a server. There is, in MDT, a specific sequence that is built to do a capture only of an existing machine. Not so reliable. This is a very, very reliable process if you need to do something manual. So I've automated like 99%, and then I decided to do some manual stuff, and then continue the process. Now, if I go back to my server here, in the settings that I have for my deployment share, I do not join that machine to Active Directory. Not that you can't, because you can, but there is no real point. The first thing sysprep will do is actually remove that machine from the domain anyway, reboot, and then, of course, it will do the capture. I've added a finish action shutdown, so once this process is complete, it will actually shut the machine down. Now, when you saw me start my client, I selected the sequence and I clicked next on the next wizard page. Could that be automated as well?
Can I have a book?
No? Of course it can. If you, for example, add in MAC address in the field, and you type in the MAC address, if you try to find the right keyboard here, here we go. Now I have changed the deployment solution to if I deploy a virtual machine with this specific MAC address, it will actually automatically select the sequence and skip the next page in the wizard. So now I only need to find a way to start a virtual machine. Turns out that PowerShell is your friend. We have a KMS server in our lab. We actually bought a KMS license just for the lab, so that we don't have to activate machines all the time through a MAC key. I mean, we deploy clients every single day. We don't have too many machines. We may have 25 of them, but we deploy them like 1,000 times. So I created a PowerShell script that will create the virtual machine, start the deployment. When it's done, during the sequence, it will activate, and when it's done, it just deletes itself. So, simple PowerShell script that you can use to create a reference image. Spawns a VM, waits an hour, deletes itself, but the Vim file, of course, is on the server at that point. So, PowerShell is king in terms of, well, creating VMs. All right. According to the script, it's you.
It's me.
Yeah. Could it be that we need to do some change? I mean, I showed you how to create a reference image for normal physical deployments. But what if I want to use my reference image for servers or for VMM or for something else?
Yes. According to Microsoft, you don't need to, and honestly, it will work. I mean, if you just create the reference image the same way. However, it will not be optimized in the same way. What we can see is, and this is somewhat sad, we can see that people working with the client deployment industry are using all these nice features, and they are really good on creating images. About a year ago, I visited a customer that is a hoster. They have a data center. They have about 1,000 physical machines in the data center. And I asked them, how do you deploy your images? They have a DVD which they run around with. And in the end of all the hallways, they have a big note on the wall with the product key typed on the wall. So my question to them was, I want to know how they create reference images, but I realized that they don't have a clue what a reference image is. They have never heard of that. They even ate lunch in the server room. I was like, oh my God. Anyway, when you create reference images for servers, you need to do something special. Can you flip over to my screen, please?
You said please, yeah?
Yes, I know the word please. No, I don't play this Halo 4, but it's a nice picture. So, for Windows Server 2012, it's a bit hard because this is what I see at customers. There are 4 versions of Windows Server 2012. That means I need to have, of course, 4 reference images. At least that is what most customers think. In Windows Server 2012, you only need 1. Question is, which one do you need? Well, there are 2 that you need to start choosing from. You either need the standard version, and I need to fire up this awfully nice tool before Johan kicks my leg anyway. Zoom it, it's called.
While you're doing Zoom it, there was a superior question in the feed.
Why don't I use Zoom it? You have these 4. We can strike 2 of them. You will never, ever need the data center edition. There is no point of creating a reference image of the data center SKU. Why is that? You can either use DISM or you can use PowerShell to change the version if needed. Therefore, if you do have both data center and standard, choose the standard as a reference image and convert it at deployment time to a data center edition if needed. So, should you do core or should you do UI? That is a good question. It doesn't really matter. You can do one or the other. If you do core, you can add the UI at deployment time. If you do UI, you can remove the UI at deployment time. So you can change and flip them back and forth. So I prefer to do it with the UI and remove either the full UI or the half UI. Because in Windows Server 2012, you can remove half of it.
Is it okay if I take a question in between, sir?
You can take a question in between.
We also got 3 identical questions posted in a really short time. And the question was, why building in Light Touch versus doing it in Config Manager? And John Ross actually was the first one to ask that question. So where is John?
He's over there.
Of course, all the way in the back.
You know we're going to have two thin images if we continue doing
Turn off the
this.
microphone before you go in front of the speaker, the loudspeaker. It will make noises. All right. Why using Light Touch instead of Config Manager? Once, because I said so. No, obviously not. First of all, doing it in Light Touch is way quicker. It's about twice as fast as doing the same stuff in Config Manager. So during the development of a reference image, you may redeploy that image like 20 times until you get it like you want it. And yes, it is a difference if that takes half the time, because it's less hours spent in that project. If you are a consultant and build by the hour, do not pay attention to me. Go ahead and spend those hours in Config Manager, because technically you can absolutely do a reference image in Config Manager. Now, also in Light Touch, you get the option of adding the suspend thing that I added. It's very tricky to do that in the Config Manager sequence. It doesn't have that option built in. If you want to do the same thing in Config Manager to have a pause in the middle while all the others is automated, you actually have to do a full build, do the customizations, take the snapshot, and then run the capture CD or capture ISO that you get from Config Manager. Then it's very, very easy in Light Touch to delegate the process. So if I wanted Mike to build my reference images, which actually happens from time to time, I can simply copy folder to him. That's it. That's the process of delegating the reference image process to Mike. Copying a folder, done. He doesn't even need to have access to my Config Manager console. Right. So he doesn't break things, deploy something to all systems or whatever.
I wouldn't do that.
You would.
Well, I'm a nice guy.
Another reason is in Light Touch, the entire deployment is run through the administrator account. And if you, thank you. If you customize anything in your reference image, you can, when you deploy that image through Config Manager, enable that thing that Michael showed you, the copy profile, in the unattended XML file in Config Manager, not when you're building the reference image. And then Config Manager will happily deploy the image and copy the admin profile that you created or customized into the default user. When you do, so all the users have a common set of settings when they log on to the machine for the first time. Does that mean I can't do similar stuff in Config Manager? No, it doesn't. It just means it's easier to do that in the Light Touch environment where you have the full Windows running and you can do point and click stuff. You can, of course, run obscure VB scripts and Config Manager sequences that will kick in and load the registry offline and inject stuff. That's possible. Absolutely. I've seen customers doing that.
So what you're talking about is the same thing. If you're charged by the hour, you should absolutely create your reference images directly in Configuration Manager. You're going to spend hours and hours to make it work. It's perfect.
And also, I mentioned this before, but the Config Manager reference image can only really be used in Config Manager because they deploy their client into it. Light Touch doesn't do that.
And here's actually a problem we see. A company using physical machines, they're deploying workstation, and suddenly someone pops the word VDI. It's like, oh my God. Okay, if we need to do VDI, and suddenly we have a reference images that we have in Configuration Manager that we cannot use in the VDI solution directly. So then we need to have another team or other folks doing that, and then we have not really the same kind of image anymore. So the user experience will be, why do we have this icon on this machine, but we don't have it on this machine? And they get all crazy about
Could there be any consequence of actually building reference images in Light Touch? Could there be a scenario where it actually would make perfect sense to actually build them in Config Manager? Yes, sir.
I ask, is that limitation to the light touch, is that applied when you integrate MBT into config manager as well? Do you still have those limitations or not?
So the question was, building it in light touch, would that be any difference if I would integrate MBT and config manager? No, if you integrate MBT and config manager, it's still a config manager deployment, so those limitations still apply there. A downside of actually doing it in light touch is that you need to have a separate WSUS to get a good quality updating. So suddenly you need to spend that 15 minutes to create a WSUS server, and you need to approve some updates every single month on it, because light touch cannot connect directly to the sub that you have in config manager. Also, if you're creating thick images, if you're, say, educational and organization, you may have 50 or 60 applications inside an image. If those applications are already in config manager, why would I spend the time duplicating those 60 apps into light touch to do my reference build there? Now, the hours I started to save by using light touch is being eaten up because I have to duplicate all those apps. So there are scenarios where you actually will use config manager, but we would like to know that there are limitations to it, and in general, light touch is the deployment solution you want to use to create reference image. It's simply a superior way of doing it.
When we do have the scenario of I need to inject the applications both in Configuration Manager and in the light touch solution, most Configuration Manager deployment means that we have the source folder on a file share. So we can have light touch to use the same file share. It's just going to install over the network. So it doesn't mean we need to have two instances of it. We need to read it from multiple locations. Yes? May I continue now?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Approved.
Perfect. You're so kind. So if we flip back and take that away, and take that away, and go back here, you can see that in Server 2012 you have the server graphical shell, you have the desktop experience, and we have the graphical management tools. All these can be added and removed. Now, the only reason to install the desktop experience is because you're going to use this as a remote desktop server, or you're running it on your own laptop and you need to read all the funny stuff. Other than that, the only thing you really need to have is that. The graphical management tools and infrastructure, that is server management. That is server management on core, which means that if you are afraid to switch into core, because you still do manual configuration on each of the server after they have been deployed, you might want to have a nice UI to be able to click around in. That's the UI. But it removes the two most important things from a server: Internet Explorer and Explorer. The only two components you don't need on a server. Never. I can't figure out why I would have them. The server graphical shell, though, is Explorer and Internet Explorer. So you can either remove both of these, then it will be a core server, or you remove one of them, and then it becomes a core server with a UI to manage. I prefer the core with UI to manage if I don't have a completely automated process. And of course, those things exist in the task sequence. So if I want to remove, because this is a standard, I can just add roles and select uninstall roles and features. And it's a bit picky. I need to pick the right operating system. And then I search for, and it's so easy to find. Somewhere, there you go. And then I remove the server graphical shell. So you can either do it and say, this is what we have as a default for our reference image, and then we either add or remove components after. So that's why you only need one reference image. Other than that, you don't really need to tweak anything except when you deploy the virtual machine. By default, in all deployment solutions, it creates the extra partition that we have. When we do virtual machines, we don't need the extra partition at all. So at deployment time, there's no need to create that. So if you do use light touch, then you can say, do not create extra partition. If you have another solution, then you need to configure that solution for not creating the extra partition, because it's no point of having it at all. There are some other things you can do with server, and that is about modifying the unattended XML file. I prefer not to do that. Instead, I prefer to either create applications that does that tweaking, because then I can reuse it in other scenarios. But there are some settings you might want to consider. The most common one is what? This one. There is no living person on this planet that likes this, and everybody turns it off. The whole point is that it's supposed to be secure, but I know how IT people works. If you have a core server, it's fine, because then it's not in use. But if you do have Internet Explorer, you're going to use Internet Explorer, because you're going to download applications, patches, and it's like, you should never do that on the server. I know, but I'm doing it right now, because I'm lazy. So what people do is that they start using this, right? And then they go out to some page and they got a prompt for your security, right? So they're going to add the entire internet to the trusted site zone. And then when they come to the download, they can't download because it's blocked. So then they go back and turn this off and go in again and browse to the same location. So what's the purpose? If everybody still ignores this and going to turn it off anyway, you might as well turn it off from the beginning, right? The next most common setting we have is remote desktop, enabling remote desktop and opening the firewall. There are not many virtual machines, at least, that have the capability of having a keyboard and a mouse. You really need RDP to the machines, or VM Connect, but most commonly it's going to be RDP. So that is another thing that we normally enable by default. If the machine is domain joined, then we enable remote desktop to it. Those are the most common settings. There are, of course, others. In 2008 R2, there's a bunch of other settings, especially for IE, the welcome page and all that stuff. That is gone in Server 2012, so we're down to about 2 settings for the server. If you do have some kind of security, policy for not turning it off, well, then you can't turn it off. But most people ignore those kind of policies anyway, I've heard. So that's about server.
There was a question that ties into your next item on the list, and that's what can we use to optimize an image used for VDI?
Yeah, so let's check out VDI. There was a session yesterday that you should look up on. You should download the PowerPoint presentation, and you should also check out a session about VDI. But basically, what we do, and this is the incorrect one. Let's check this one. What we do to optimize is this. There is a bunch of services you don't need anymore. For Windows 7, it's more things to turn off. For Windows 8, it's not that many anymore. Windows 8 is better, and understands VDI's situations better. But still, there's a bunch of settings you might want to turn off. So in this case, we first start by running a PowerShell command. Instead of creating one giant PowerShell script, I prefer to have each and every function as an action in my task sequence. That way I can turn things on and off instead of going into the script and try to modify it. Every time you modify a script, you need to try it again, and when you try it again, you've seen the red text when you do PowerShell, right? Yeah. That's bad. So instead of doing that, I have all the functions separated. So to be able to run that, I do set the execution policy to the most dangerous level you can, which means bypass, which means ignore everything and just run it. Remote signed is a bit more secure, but then we have problem with downloaded applications because they still belongs to the internet zone. So that's why I do bypass. As you can see down here, I actually restore that. So I only have it in the task sequence while I'm running my PowerShell commands. Then I reset the PowerShell execution policy back again. And here is some examples of what you could disable or should disable. We don't need to have tablet services, or we might need to have that. VLAN, auto-config for Windows 7, for instance. Restore point, system restore, hibernation. There's a lot of things. This list works both for Windows 7 and for Windows 8. For Windows 7, it will disable everything. For Windows 8, it won't disable everything because all of these things doesn't exist in Windows 8, but I use the same configuration, and I instead flag those to keep on running even if the command fails. So each of these are either registry hack or, as you can see, a basic standard PowerShell command. This is easier than to do a VB script. At least that is what I think, because it's easy to enable and disable, and I can copy and paste all that stuff. It becomes a really big task sequence, but that's fine. So there's a lot of tweaks you can do. Not only do you need to do tweaks, you also need to do other things like deciding should you do 32 or 64 when you do VDI. 32 has a smaller footprint, but on the other hand, it's limited to like 4 gigs in RAM, so that might not work. You should decide for either 32 or 64, but be prepared to create reference images for the other type and say, you know, that is the second alternative we have. This is the primary, this is the secondary. Go for one and have the other one as a secondary. There is another way of doing this, of course. If you browse the internet, you will find the script. It is originally from an application called VDI Optimizer. I'm not sure it still exists. It used to exist, at least. From Jonathan Bennett. I think he's a former Microsoft consulting guy. If you go to Auto IT Script, he's created an application that creates a VB script that basically turns all these things off. It is designed for Windows 7, but the idea is basically the same for Windows 8. It's a nice UI.
Did you forget Zoom it?
No, but the thing is, did I forget Zoom it? Ouch! I hate myself. Where do I have Zoom it? I should have Zoom it somewhere.
Live systemterminals.com?
Yeah, I always have a systemterminals folder. Here it is. Is
It's for the people in the sheep seat, so they can
Yeah.
see.
over there. So you just click all these stuff, and the net result will be a VB script. This is just for Windows 7. The blog post I showed you here is for Windows 8. It does basically the same thing. I don't use these VB scripts. Instead, I convert them into decent task sequences. It's easier to read, and I can enable and disable them as I wish. Internet connectivity is not perfect right now. So that's what you need to do. Another scenario we have for reference images is actually Windows to Go. I did a Windows to Go session this week. I can't remember what day. Anyhow, they are a bit special too, because they need to have drivers. We are so hard fighting to get people to understand never put drivers in the images. And suddenly Microsoft showed us Windows to Go, and I was like, shoo, I need to tell people to put drivers in the image. My creds will go like that.
Technically, I mean, it doesn't have to be in the reference image. Michael Niehaus just blogged like 25 minutes ago that you can also use he's apparently in this room somewhere, that you can also use the Windows to Go provisioning as a way to inject the drivers.
Yes.
When you create it. So it doesn't have to be in the reference image. But it helps if the driver is actually on the stick when you try to boot it. So one way or another, get the drivers in there.
The most important thing is that you pick the right drivers. So here's the list of drivers. You can see I have drivers for a certain model, and that is drivers we will inject when we deploy a machine. So of course they should go into a Windows to Go USB device. Incorrect. Those drivers are not needed for Windows to Go functionality. You need to think differently when you do Windows to Go. You need to have generic driver. You need to have vendor's driver, and need to focus on, let's cover NVIDIA and let's cover ATI. Let's cover Intel and let's cover Broadcom and let's cover, and the only 3 drivers you need to focus on is network, storage, and graphic. Windows to Go will automatically kick in a Windows update sequence after it's been booting up on a new machine to download drivers from Windows Update. And most likely you're not going to use all these fancy stuff like fingerprint readers or a TPM chip or whatever you have in that machine. It's a Windows to Go device. So these drivers you shouldn't put in because they're not needed. So go for generic drivers instead. Now, I talked about creating reference images for server. And one of the solutions that Microsoft has is called System Center Virtual Machine Manager. And creating a reference image for Windows Server to put in Virtual Machine Manager makes perfectly sense.
Or Windows 8.
Or Windows 8. And when you do that the first time, it fails.
You get surprised.
Yeah, because you deploy the machine and you call it Bob 400, and you join it into the domain and you configure nice settings in Virtual Machine Manager because you have a template. And nothing happens because the machine boots up and it's called mini-NT blah 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 something. It's like, what? And you try again because you try a couple of times before you realize that there's something wrong with System Center Virtual Machine Manager. But it's not. It's a glitch. When Microsoft Deployment Toolkit installed the reference image and you save that as a VHDX file, it's going to be a small file somewhere. Let's open that up.
There is actually an idea for a future session being posted in the Twitter feed, and that's we should have an MDT versus config manager session that involved swords and fighting. That could be fun.
Yeah, that could be fun.
It's not an entirely bad idea,
No.
actually. And speaking of the Twitter feed, this is actually not a question, but it's worth a book because it's being, well, pretty straight to the point. Someone actually spotted that I was running an application on my server 2012 machine that is normally not on a server, and that is the mission-critical application StarCraft. And it actually runs great on server 2012. Let's try to find the name of it. You can continue while I've tried to find the name.
So in the image, you have a folder called Panther, and in Panther, the unattended XML file ends up. So we done the creating of a reference image, and in that reference image, we now have an unattended XML file in the Panther folder. System Center Virtual Machine Manager does the customization of that image by creating a virtual floppy. And they put the unattended file on the virtual floppy. At the same time, there's another unattended file in the Panther folder. Guess which one is winning? The floppy is not winning. So that means that when you create reference images for System Center Virtual Machine Manager, you need to remove that tiny thing.
By the way, who is Matt Atkinson? All right, I'll be running this time.
Yeah, I would like to see that. Run, Forrest, run. So we created a small application that actually removes the unattended XML file, and that way the image is really clean. So all kinds of different deployment solution will not interfere with the existed unattended XML file.
Did you see that?
Yeah, you were so
Gracious.
yeah, like an elephant,
Not at all.
but tiny. So we need to remove this file. This is one of the most common issues, and here's the boring thing, because we see customers, they try and they fail, and then they go like, oh shoot, I'm going to do the reference image manually. So then they manually install the server, install all the patches, and then they use the Virtual Machine Manager capture process, which is, yeah. So don't do that. Instead, flip over and use this script. And it's not that hard. And this script looks like this. Applications, remove unattended XML file. And if we open with Notepad, you can see it's just trying to remove the Panther file. That is the only thing you need to remove. So you should do that even for VDI. So to be honest, if you do capture it as a VHDX file or VHD file, that doesn't get removed correctly. Therefore, you should remove it manually. And speaking about VHDX files, so where do you run that application? Well, if I go into my reference image here, you can see that there's no application at all being installed here. And we install the operating system, and we have the state restore, and we have the custom tasks, and we have a post sequence. But that little application is put in here. So when we do select sysprep only, we execute sysprep, and after we execute sysprep, we remove the unattended XML file. It's a bad thing to remove it before, because it's actually going to be used. So that is what we do to make this server work. So for server, it's pretty easy. For VDI, you need to tweak a lot to make them perfect. And someone might ask you, why do you need to tweak a VDI image anyway? It depends on how many VDI machines you're running. It has to do with efficiency. If you can remove 2-3% of a machine, the CPU performance from that machine, and get it back. Maybe you can have a couple of more VDI machines at the same time. There is one other thing we do with VDI machines. You might have installed application in your reference image. It might be a thick VDI image. In that case, you have a lot of apps running. Do you exactly know what kind of applications that are running while the machine is doing nothing? There is if internet actually works. Yes, it works. If you fire up the auto runs, so when you have created your image and you think everything is good, if you use auto runs, you will be able to see every little piece that it gets loaded that has changed. So here's what's running during logon. Do we really need all these applications? These consumes memory and CPU cycles, and they also consume disk I/O. And for a precious VDI solution, disk I/O is the key to performance. So if you can get rid of 10% of the disk I/O, you're going to make the server guys really happy, because then you can jank out some more VDI machines at the same time. This is not a bad idea to do, even if you are using a standard normal reference image either, but it's not the same thing, because on a laptop or a desktop we normally have plenty of CPU and plenty of I/O and plenty of resources anywhere. It's just on a VDI solution we don't have that.
There is a few questions coming in related to reference images, and the first one was, what about additional cleaning when sysprep runs? I mean, sysprep will do a lot of cleaning when it runs, like drivers, unless you tell it not to, event logs, and a lot of other stuff is doing a cleaning. But you can absolutely have custom scripts that does additional cleaning as well. But please be aware of that when the capture is happening. There is actually let me see if I can find that one. There is a file called Vim script ini, and that's a list of all the files that are not being captured, or folders that are not being captured in the reference image. So for example, you can see it does exclude some folders, and you can change this. You can modify this to your heart's content. So if there is a folder or file that you never ever would like to have in a reference image because it doesn't make sense, you can just add that to this file, and that will work as well.
And there you can see it's removing the Panther folder, but it's only doing that when we do a capture. When we just say sysprep, it's going to leave it.
Exactly. There is another question related to language packs. Do we put them in the reference image? Yes, we do, unless it's too many of them. If a customer only has like 4 or 5 language packs, it makes perfectly sense to add them to the reference image, because then when you deploy that image, you can simply use logic in Config Manager or in Light Touch to select a different language depending on, for example, the gateway that machine or that subnet is being on. So I can say, well, not the input language, but UI language equals something. And if my language pack is in the image already, it will automatically assign that as a display language.
And there is another story around Windows 8. The language packs in Windows 8 is available for everyone. So any user can download any kind of language packs at any time they would like. So even if you have an organization with, let's say, 45 different languages, but it's only like 5 of these languages that are the corporate standard, then you deploy them, and for the other 39 languages, you tell the user, if you really want it in Slovenian or Swedish or Danish or... Nobody wants it in Danish, but...
Another question coming in. All right, so you do have a reference image and you add it into Config Manager. All right, it's simply as right-click in the OS and add that image that you got from the light touch build. You saw me when I started this setup, I could specify a folder. Why not specify a folder which my Config Manager server has access to? It could be a file server or on the site server itself. I prefer a file server. And the follow-up question was, all right, so I have it in the Config Manager. What about customizations? What about the new pre-provisioning? I think BitLocker pre-provisioning. Well, in the sequence template, once you do have MDT integrated, there is a ready-made action for pre-provisioning BitLocker, and that works for Windows 7 and Windows 8. This only works, of course, if you are SP1, because this requires WinP4. And without SP1, you don't get WinP4. What this will do, it will start encryption. I mean, this is the pre-install phase. This is in WinPE. It will start the encryption before it applies the drive or the image to the drive. So it doesn't add any extra time to do encryption. Without WinP4, without this action, the pre-provisioning stuff, you can actually look at 2, 3, 4 hours sometimes before a machine is fully encrypted with BitLocker. But if your normal deployment takes 30 minutes, you enable this or you have this, it still takes 30 minutes, but the machine is protected when it's ready. Because later in the process, here we go, it will just enable the protectors, and that's really quick.
There's a question popping up or a comment popping up on the Twitter feed, and that is to use orchestrator runbooks to completely create this. And I would say, yeah, absolutely. Using runbooks to do all this works really nice. We could either have a runbook that creates the virtual machine, or we can use PowerShell to kick it off. And then we can execute the runbook within the sequence and say, in the end, when the installation has been successful, feed in all the parameters from that machine so that the orchestrator runbook will find that VM and grab the VM, the Vim file, and then take the Vim file and inject it in Configuration Manager. So it's absolutely possible to do an entire automated process that is scheduled. So it will create the reference image on a monthly or 3 months or 4 months basis.
So we did a session on Wednesday. That's the session code, DCB3103, which shows you how to call runbooks from the sequence, both the config manager sequence and the light touch sequence here. So with that, this is a website where you can find additional information related to OSD, all kinds of them. We have links to our blogs, Deployment Research and Deployment Bunny, and all the other links that we normally read. People out there like the deployment guys, etc., Alex and all his blog, Nihau's blog, all that for additional information. Books to read up on, videos, trainings to attend, whatever. And this is the final session for us at MMS. It has been a great, great journey. Have great fun, and I have never been so tired in my entire life. But it's great fun. Please fill in the eval. As always, we say be honest but gentle, and have a safe trip home, guys. Thank you.
Thank you all.